The first thing she noticed was how quickly dusk had begun arriving, though the calendar claimed spring was still weeks away from conceding to summer. Shadows grew long by 6, the sky anemic and strangely bruised in color, as though the sun itself hesitated to linger. She had grown used to these late afternoons as the backdrop for her work. Her laptop sat perched on the corner of the dining room table, a place she claimed years ago when working from home had become a permanent arrangement. The sound of neighborhood children carried through her slightly open window, their shouts, their bickering, the staccato rhythm of sneakers on pavement. At first, the sounds had been comforting, a chorus of life and proof of community in a cul-de-sac lined with young families. But lately, there was something brittle to the way their voices echoed. She would pause in her typing and realize it wasn't the laughter she heard, but silence between bursts of noise, pauses stretched just long enough to feel wrong, as though the children were aware of something she wasn't. She shook herself of the thought most days, made another cup of coffee, and scrolled back to her spreadsheets, her endless video calls with colleagues whose faces were always framed by soft lamps and carefully arranged bookshelves. But she had begun noticing more. For instance, a boy, maybe 10, who lingered by the stop sign across from her house each afternoon. She didn't recognize him as belonging to the families she knew. The first time she noticed, he had his bike with him, one foot balanced lazily on the curb, his head turned toward the children, running up and down the cul-de-sac. She assumed he was new, perhaps visiting a relative, but when she glanced again 10 minutes later, he was still there, standing in exactly the same way, as if frozen in waiting. The next day, he was there again. She mentioned it casually to one of her neighbors, Laura, who laughed it off. "You're always looking out that window," Laura teased, sipping from her wine glass. "You need to get out more. He's probably just waiting for a friend." Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the boy's presence was deliberate, that he wasn't watching for a friend, but watching the others. Watching too intently. Days blurred together, as they often did when the only rhythm of her life was the workday and the slow bleed into evening. Her laptop hummed constantly, the glow of its screen bleaching her face. And yet, her attention more and more drifted outside. She timed her breaks to coincide with the hours when children came out to play, her ear trained for the sound of sudden silence. It was the stillness that unnerved her most, the way a game of tag could unravel into abrupt quiet. She imagined the children stopping, eyes darting towards something unseen. It made her palms sweat, her cursor hover uselessly over cells and numbers. The boy appeared less often, but other things began to intrude. Once, walking to her mailbox at dusk, she caught movement in her periphery, a shadow slipping across the hedge line, low to the ground, darting fast. When she spun, nothing was there. The neighborhood sat in its ordinary hush, the buzz of insects, and the rumble of a distant lawn mower the only sounds. She forced a laugh at herself. "You're overtired," she whispered aloud, as if hearing the words would anchor them in truth. But her heart raced until she was back inside, the door locked. The children played, as always, though she began noticing how fewer parents came outside. When she had moved here, mothers and fathers clustered at driveways with folding chairs and tumblers, their presence a loose safety net stretched around the cul-de-sac. Now it was often just the children, unsupervised, their voices rising under a dimming sky. Sometimes, she thought she saw them looking past her house, toward the hedge where she'd seen the shadow. Other times, she swore she saw one of them flinch, as though something brushed too close. One Saturday evening, unable to resist, she stepped outside and lingered by her front garden, feigning interest in the brittle lavender she'd failed to keep alive. She watched the children across the way, a cluster of 5 of them, their play disjointed. She realized with a pang that she didn't know most of their names anymore. They had grown quickly, sprouted taller in what felt like weeks. Their faces seemed thinner, sharper, a little pale under the street lamps. She tried to smile, to wave at one of them, a little girl with pigtails, shoelaces trailing. But the girl stopped mid-run and stared at her. There was no recognition in the child's eyes, only an unreadable flatness. It lasted seconds, but it left her with a chill that clung even after she retreated inside. That night, she dreamed of the cul-de-sac empty, the asphalt slick as though rain had passed. Only, the ground was not wet with water, but with something darker, a sheen that reflected faint, trembling lights. She woke at 3 a.m, sheets tangled, her throat dry. She swore she heard footsteps outside her window, too quick and too light to belong to an adult. When she dared to look, she saw nothing. Only the faint sway of the hedges, though the air was still. Her work began to suffer. She missed meetings, her reports riddled with mistakes. Co-workers sent gentle reminders, questions phrased in the language of corporate concern. But she could not drag her focus away from the certainty growing inside her chest. Something was here, something unseen. The boy at the stop sign never returned after the first week. But in his absence, she realized her thoughts had filled the gap. She remembered details of him that she couldn't prove. Had his hair been dark or light? Had he even had a bike, or was that her invention? The more she tried to pin it down, the more it slipped. Still, the feeling worsened. She started keeping the curtains drawn, but even through fabric she swore she saw movement, something low, something quick, tracing the edges of the neighborhood. She began hearing faint sounds on the recordings of her work meetings, distortions like children's laughter submerged underwater. Once, she caught herself staring at her webcam image, convinced something shifted just behind her, though when she turned, the room was empty. The children outside grew quieter as the weeks passed. Their games carried on, but their laughter came thinner, more cautious, as though they played with an ear bent towards something she could not hear. At night, she lay awake and listened, heart pounding. She told herself nothing was there, that nothing could be there, but doubt seeped into every hour, staining her days with unease. And then, one evening, she looked out to see the cul-de-sac completely still. Not one child in sight. The absence was louder than any scream. The stillness held for a minute, that stretched thin and buzzing, a filament pulled too tight. She waited for a door to slam, for some late-arriving child to burst out laughing, for a bicycle wheel to click. She waited long enough that her eyes watered from staring. Nothing. She shut her laptop without looking, the hinges sounding louder than they should have in the hushed room. In the window's reflection, she saw a version of herself with flat, pale skin and hair she kept meaning to cut. She didn't turn on any lamps. She didn't want the glass to become a mirror that made the outside vanish. She wanted to keep watch. When the first movement came, it was only a grocery bag, a house down skittering across the pavement, the wind dragging it unwillingly like an animal, then letting it go. She let breath out slowly, the bag snagged against a curb. She could feel her own pulse in her throat, an embarrassingly loud metronome. A car turned into the cul-de-sac, humming quietly, headlights painting the houses with softened white. It belonged to the family with the newer minivan, the one with a stick-figure family decal on the window that had acquired 2 dogs in the last month. The car eased into its driveway and idled there. No one got out for a long time. When they finally did, it was 2 adults only, heads bent, talking fast, their bodies angled toward one another as if sharing heat. She watched them fail to notice her as they walked inside. Later that night, after she brushed her teeth and didn't bother with the moisturizer on the counter, its cap crusted with dried cream in a ring that looked like a fossil, she lay on her back with her hands folded on her stomach like a figure in a glass coffin. She told herself to sleep. She told herself nothing was happening. She told herself what she already knew, that her days were a loop that clicked into place in the morning and bled into night, where her mind had more room to move, too much space to invent. Around 2 or 3, the squeak of what could have been a swing set began to sound. A slow creak, as if something was heavy and did not want to be. Her neighborhood did not have a playground within earshot. She lay with her eyes open, watching the rectangle of the window's pale gray, until the creak faded and left her with silence again, a silence that felt varnished and hard. In the morning, she went out earlier than usual to check her mailbox with the unnecessary urgency of someone pretending to find purpose. The air held that almost summer damp, the pavement's warmth rising through her soles. The street looked ordinary. A sprinkler sputtered somewhere, a little mechanical hiccup. There were chalk marks on the pavement in front of the house across from hers, bright pastel lines forming a long hopscotch grid, but not numbered. Where numbers should have been, there were scratches, the chalk knocked away down to the asphalt, as if a small palm had smudged and smudged until even the ghost of the line was gone. She stood there looking at the grid too long. The chalk colors were cheerful, the kind that should never be ominous. Blue, pink, yellow, the smudges were just smudges. She told herself she could see where the child had leaned. She told herself she could imagine the shape of elbows. Her eyes kept returning to where the numbers should be, and weren't. Laura texted around 9. Close-up photo of a steaming mug and a caption. Sun's out, coffee's perfect. Sit in the driveway with me. The driveway social rituals had never appealed to her. Not even when she was trying to be the kind of person who sat on plastic Adirondack chairs and called across the street to the people she barely knew, but she typed yes before she could think of a way to avoid it. Laura had on new sandals that she tilted her feet to show off. Target, she said, rolling her eyes in a way that implied an apology for how middle-class everything was. Her hair was scraped into a ponytail that should have looked severe, but didn't. You look tired. Are they still keeping you on those late calls? They're fine. She sipped and blew steam across the mug with deliberate attentiveness. The asphalt radiated a soft heat that made everything smell faintly of rubber. Do the kids still play much out here? I feel like I hear them less. Laura wrinkled her nose, thinking. They do, but mine are all screens now. She laughed, then half-sighed. Honestly, it's been nice. Fewer things to worry about. Except, she gestured vaguely. A hush motion that filled in a lot of space without naming anything. Anyway, you doing okay? She nodded. The nod was a lie that felt like an old sweater gone stiff at the elbows. I've just been working more. Get out with us Friday. Laura said, eyes darting toward the street, toward the chalk, as if she, too, had noticed something wrong about it, but refused to give it words. We're doing pizza on blankets. The kids can, scream about Roblox. You can touch the grass. Vitamin D. The idea made her throat feel tight. She pictured lying on a blanket while the children made those erratic circles around the cul-de-sac, as if orbiting something only they could see. She pictured the way one little girl had looked at her weeks ago, blank, flat. She pictured her hands lying on her stomach, like last night, while a sky watched her instead. I might, she said, the word slippery. Let me see how work is. When she went back inside, she kept the curtains open. She told herself she would stop checking the window every few minutes. She failed and checked anyway. She began to bring her laptop to the window table as though proximity to the outside would help. And then she put the laptop back on the dining table as though distance would fix something else. She couldn't find the right place for herself in her own house. She walked between rooms like someone rehearsing a fire drill. On her afternoon call, the software engineer in Denver started to share his screen, a spreadsheet that jittered when he scrolled. Her face, in the corner of her own monitor, looked like it didn't belong to anyone who was fully awake. The Denver engineer said something about data dependencies. She nodded at the right times. And then something brushed the edge of vision. She flicked her eyes towards the window reflexively, where so often there was nothing. This time there were two children at the curb across the street, motionless, one with a scooter tipped sideways under a foot, one with hair crying out for a comb. They stood with the understated patience of kids waiting for a ride. They looked toward the hedge line, then toward her house, then at each other. Their mouths moved, but there was no sound through the glass. Not even the high, bright vowels that usually pierced everything. The Denver engineer said, "Does that make sense, Jen?" And she said yes, because it did, in the way that everything made some kind of sense if you agreed to pretend. Later, after the call, she went to the window and pretended to adjust the plant that didn't need adjusting. The children were gone. The place where the scooter had been, there was a thin black scrape on the curb. She stared at it long enough to feel foolish. The next morning, she began a spreadsheet of her own. It was absurd. She knew that even as she typed headers. Time of day, number of children. Volume. Notable anomalies. She laughed at herself. She added a column, silence length. For the first hour of her vigil, she never called it that aloud. She recorded ordinary things. 3 at 3:15 p.m., one on a bike, a girl in pink shirt. A dog barked from next door, where a dog always barked. She recorded that, too, in case the usualness itself would one day become suspect. At 4:02, the laughter cut off. 2 seconds, 0.3. She began counting like a child hiding in a closet, the count itself a kind of talisman. She reached 12 before the sound returned, but when it came back it was thin, as if pushed through a straw. She wrote thin, laughter point 12 seconds. She put it in the spreadsheet like the kind of data that would change something if only it could be recorded firmly enough. By 5, she had a small cluster of entries, so ordinary on the screen that she felt silly and triumphant both. She shaded the thin laughter cell light gray, as if color coding would add depth to a feeling. She closed the document as if it might be proud of her. That night she fell asleep without meaning to and dreamed of squares of color floating slow, like chalk dust suspended in a sunbeam, too many to count, and beneath them a black surface polished to a sheen until she could see her face in it, distorted long. On Thursday, Laura sent another text. Friday still on. Bring a blanket. You can borrow ours if you don't have one. Laura's texts always assumed gentleness would make you say yes. She typed out 3 different responses. Absolutely. I'll try. I'm not great with groups, and deleted all 3. She left it unread, so the bubble of expectation would fall back to Laura's pocket, where she could pretend it had never existed. That afternoon, there were drawing papers littered across the sidewalk 2 houses down, weighted with rocks at the corners to keep them from blowing away. She could see only the edges from her window, the way the paper had wrinkled from crayons pressed too hard. She wanted to go look, but also didn't want to go look. Curiosity made a decision for her after an hour of thinking. She was still deciding. Up close, the drawings were chaotic, but no more so than any cluster made by 6-year-olds. Heavy outlines, heads too big for bodies. On one page a set of eyes took up most of the space, drawn, erased, drawn again until the paper had nearly torn. Another had a house with no door. On another, a line of kids drawn as stick bodies without hands. She looked around, as though someone might catch her looking. The street was empty enough to be a staged set. One of the rocks had a fossil stripe cutting through it, a white seam. She turned it in her fingers, then put it back with the care of a thief. She took 2 steps away before the tiny absurdity of that guilt made her laugh aloud. The sound startled her. It sat on top of the empty street, like something that didn't belong. She was almost back to her house when she saw the handprints on her front window. At first she thought they were smudges like any other, the residue of days. But then she saw the shape, a small left hand, a smaller right, the size of toddlers, maybe, but too high up for toddlers to have reached without help. They were not fully formed prints, more like a suggestion of prints made with something damp that had evaporated before it could settle. She stood with her key in the lock and stared at them, not moving. She had the sudden thought that if she wiped them away she would regret it, that the absence would be worse than the thing itself. She opened the door and went inside, leaving the prints there to be present and inexplicable. It became hard to tell one day from the next in a way that went beyond mere routine. She woke from the same dream 4 nights in a row, the chalk colors, the polished asphalt, her own face elongated into something that didn't look human, and then the 5th night she didn't dream at all and woke with a hollow feeling like when a train you did not mean to catch leaves, and you find yourself watching it, unable to remember where you had been intending to go. She tried to call her mother. Her mother always answered with too much worry, a tonic that sometimes helped and sometimes made her feel like she was made of gauze. This time, the call rang 4 times and clicked to voicemail. Her mother's message was the same one she'd had for years, recorded in a kitchen with clattering dishes in the background, slightly breathless. Hearing it made her feel sudden, complicated anger. She hung up without leaving anything. The house felt louder in the silence after. She bought a small camera online, the kind advertised for home security with a cheerfully blank blinking light and a promise of an app. When it arrived, she set it up to point at the patch of street just beyond her hedge. She told herself it was wasteful, silly. She told herself it would make her sleep. It sat like a single eye. She checked its feed compulsively for a day, then forced herself to stop until night. The first night of the camera, she lay in bed and watched the live feed, as if it were a show. The street lamp drew a cone of light that insects traced. A cat crossed the frame. When she replayed the footage at 2 in the morning, time sped up made everything look stranger. The cat elongated into a streak, the insects a smoky halo. At 1:11, the frame glitched. It wasn't the normal compression. It was a kind of smear, the curve of light bending as if the lens had been touched. A dim shape, a hint of a person, was briefly there and then not. She paused the frame and put her face closer to the screen, knowing it would be nothing, telling herself it was nothing, believing in that knowledge like someone clutching an edge. The shape remained non-committal. She closed the app. She didn't sleep. Friday came whether she wanted it or not. At 6, the first blanket appeared, a rectangle of floral on the grass. A second joined, blue plaid. Someone carried a stack of pizza boxes with theatrical grunting. Children swarmed, their chaotic magnetism sudden, as if they had been elsewhere and then arrived all at once together. She stood at her window with the curtains back, the cameras light a small witness on the sill. The children laughed in quick, bright spikes of sound, then turned their heads in unison toward the same point in space, and went quiet for half a breath before continuing. It could have been nothing. That IT could have been a shared joke. It could have been, Laura texted, "You coming?" She typed, "Maybe in a bit." Laura responded with a thumbs up that felt like a dare. She went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, and didn't drink it, then poured the water down the sink because the act of pouring had become the act. She stood there with her hands on the cool edge of the counter until her palms hurt. Then she went out. She brought nothing with her. She told herself a walk to the mailbox, that easy errand. And then perhaps she would just happen to pause at the periphery of the blankets, a harmless satellite. The evening smelled like cut grass and tomato sauce. Voices rose and fell. She crossed the asphalt slowly, feeling visible in a way she hated, like the street had become a stage. Laura caught sight of her and lifted her chin in a kind of shorthand welcome. "Hey," Laura called. "Sit. I'm heading to the mailbox," she said, which made Laura laugh even though it was not a joke. She stood at the edge of the grass, and a small boy almost crashed into her, then stopped dead, eyes wide as if she were a wall that could not be navigated. "Sorry," he whispered, then ran on, lips moving around words she could not hear. She looked at the kids clustered around the pizza boxes. They were less pale up close than they had looked from the window, their cheeks smeared with grease and colored sugar. They were children. One wore a shirt that said "Be kind" in block letters. A girl picked pepperoni off and stuck it to her cheeks like scales. They were children, and yet there was an undercurrent she could not name, the way they seemed to talk without talking, eyes flicking toward the hedge line, not with fear, not even with interest, but with the kind of acknowledgement you give to a chair you walk around because it's part of the room. "Will you sit?" Laura asked again, patience and impatience braided together. She Saturday the blanket's fabric had a stubborn texture that caught on her bare arms. She half listened to someone describe a new teacher, while her gaze kept returning to the edge of the gathering. Several younger kids had started a circle game, not ring around the rosy, exactly, but something with a rhythm that wasn't quite right. Their feet shuffled slower than the clapping of their hands. Their voices rose, low, like a chant learned by accident. She leaned toward the sound, trying to decode the syllables, but they dissolved as soon as she paid attention, smearing into nonsense. When she let her mind drift, the rhythm came back, almost words, almost a pattern she might recognize if she had known it once and forgotten. The more she tried, the less she heard. A shadow crossed the circle and made the game hiccup. She looked up to see a man she barely knew standing just inside the streetlight's cone. The man waved his phone like a torch. "Tech trouble," he said. "No signal. Anyone else?" People reached for pockets, reflexively checked. A murmur, some yes, some no. Someone joked that the cul-de-sac was cursed. Laughter ran a short, neat circuit and died with an efficient kind of mercy. She left before it got fully dark. Laura did not stop her. At her front door, she looked back. The circle game had dissolved. The kids had reassembled into little knots, 2 and 3 and 5, their shoulders touching. One boy stood at the very edge, apart, his hands in his pockets. He had the particular way of standing like the boy she had watched by the stop sign the first week. She stared until the boy seemed to sense being seen, and lifted his head. She could not see his face clearly. Streetlights turned the whites of his eyes into reflective animal glows. Or maybe that was the trick her mind played. The way cameras make even ordinary sights look uncanny in low light. She went inside and shut the door. That night the camera's app sent her an alert. Motion detected. 9:21 p.m. She opened it with a thrill she hated herself for having. The footage showed the hedge line in grayscale. Something small darted across at the very bottom of the frame. A blur. A cat, she told herself, or a rabbit. At 9:23, there was nothing, the screen a static painting. At 9:24, the camera glitched again, a smear of light, and then the faintest impression of a face too close to the lens, a child's face, distorted large, the way you look if you press your nose to glass. The features were unruly in the distortion, the mouth wider than mouths are, the pupils too round, the forehead like a cliff. She scrubbed back and forth. Each time, the imprint of a face was there for a single frame, there and gone, like something that looks at you when you blink and not when you stare. When she went to the actual window to check, the handprints were still there from days before. She set her own palm against the glass near them and found the coolness reassuring, and no help. She began to forget small things. She would walk into the kitchen and stand with the refrigerator door open long enough for its motor to sound offended, and she would be unable to remember what she had come for. She put her phone in the freezer once, found it 2 hours later by accident, by the dull glow that managed to get through when she opened the door again for ice. She laughed, a short, hard thing that cracked in the middle. She wrote herself notes on sticky paper, then started to distrust the notes. Had she written them, or had she woken to find them already written? The children were out less for a week. She had her spreadsheet open on her computer with no new data. It made her feel as though she had been excused from a job she had invented for herself, grief and relief and boredom mixing. She worked more. She sat on calls where voices layered, everyone else's normal urgency a strange, muffled thing in her ears. She said, "Let's circle back," and that timeline feels aggressive, like a person who knows what she is saying. At night, she lay awake, listening for a swing that wasn't there. On a Tuesday it rained. The rain came hard for half an hour and then stopped absolutely, as if a faucet had been turned off. The street looked varnished, home to a slick that made every reflection sharp. She stood at the window with her mug. The handprints had softened in the rain and then dried again, as if sealed in. She pressed a finger to the glass and left a clean dot. The dot made her feel guilty. She rubbed the whole panel with a paper towel until it squeaked, then stepped back and wished she hadn't. On the wet street, there were footprints. She noticed them only after her eye had caught the glimmering version of itself in the pavement. The prints were small, bare feet, toes splayed. At first she thought they were only one set, then two, then she realized the pattern was wrong if there were only two. There were many going in all directions across the circle of the cul-de-sac, the kind of crisscross a flock of birds might make if they stepped instead of flew. She told herself they were from earlier, when someone's kids had danced in the rain and then run laughing up and down the asphalt, leaving their mark. She told herself that, of course. She told herself and believed, and then stopped believing, and then believed again, a wave pattern that exhausted her. She reached for her phone to take a picture, and then put the phone down without doing it, as if evidence would shift something she didn't want shifted. That night she dreamed she was at her own window, looking out at herself at her window, a flipping mirror. In the dream, she raised her hand to her own hand, and on the other side of the glass the other self did not move, as if out of sync, a beat delayed. She woke feeling unspooled. Making coffee felt like threading a needle with her eyes closed. Laura texted less. Maybe Laura was busy. Maybe Laura had decided that people who didn't come sit on blankets were the kind of people she would wave at across the street and not try too hard to include. The thought carried an ache that was not about Laura. It was about being the kind of person certain things happened to and certain things didn't. On her porch, packages accumulated, things she had ordered late at night. A book everyone had supposedly read already, a new brand of tea promising better sleep, a front door mat with a dumb smiling sun. The mat felt like a provocation. She set it down anyway. She opened the camera app less. The blinking light on the device at the window felt like an eye she'd grown tired of. When she did check it, nothing was there. An empty street, an empty frame. A moth that landed briefly on the lens and made a starburst smear before leaving. She deleted the app and reinstalled it, and told herself the placebo would help. Children returned to the cul-de-sac slowly, like a tide. More returned each day, until one day it felt like peak summer even though it wasn't. They had popsicles that bled colors into their hands. They left scooter helmets upside down on the grass, a row of empty shells. They clustered to trade cards, heads bent, then scattered like they'd never been together. She watched them lean their bikes against the same fence, one after another, a repetition that made her skin itch lightly. A small boy with a gap between his front teeth walked past her house while she stood in the entry, the door half open. He stopped and looked up at her, not shy, not forward, just the way kids look when they see an adult who is not their parent and who usually should be inside. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said, voice unreliable. "Do you have water?" She did. She went to get it and spent too long picking which glass because the wrongness of any choice felt like a litmus. She brought a disposable cup back because that made it simpler. The boy drank in 3 heavy gulps. then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He handed her the cup, and she took it because it didn't occur to her not to. "Thank you," he said, polite, then turned to go. He took 2 steps and turned back. "You should come outside more," he said, not as advice, not as kindness, just as something said. She wanted to ask him what game they had been playing last week, the circle game. She wanted to ask him if there was a rhyme, what the words were. She wanted to ask him if he had ever stood very still because he was listening to something he thought no one else could hear. Instead she said, "Okay," and closed the door. She held the used cup in 2 fingers, reluctant to throw it away, as if it contained something she had been seeking. It didn't. It was a cup. Work sent an email. Due to restructuring, there would be changes. She read it 3 times, each time less able to understand it. She imagined her job slipping sideways out of her hands like a tray she'd been balancing, imagined walking out to check the mail and not needing to come back. The thought landed in her chest and then sat there, heavy and calm. She closed the email without replying to the thread of half-panicked questions that exploded 5 minutes after announcement. An afternoon, heat soft like velvet, the air thick. The neighborhood sounded far away. A dark smear on the pavement resolved itself into a length of rope someone had abandoned, and then into a shadow. Her eyes had begun to play more tricks than usual by then. She leaned into the window and let the glass take some of her weight. The glass had a faint give to it she had never noticed before. From the side of the house came a noise like something small tumbling. She went to the side door, opened it, and looked at the narrow strip of gravel and spare trash cans and the coiled hose. A frog jumped awkwardly between 2 pebbles and then disappeared beneath the hosta leaves. She laughed once, too softly to count as a sound. The hosta leaves looked like tongues. Her camera blinked on the sill, a patient eye. She turned it to face inside for a day. When she watched that feed in the evening, she saw only herself moving from room to room, a ghost who haunted her own house. She stopped the video when she reached the frame where she stood at the window. For a moment, at a particular angle, there was another tone of light behind her, hardly anything at all, and she froze the frame on that, as if ing something would make it real. She put the camera back to face out. When she slept, it was with a sense that sleep was a surface and something could be under it, moving. She dreamed that she walked out to the cul-de-sac at midnight and found it full of children sitting cross-legged, eyes closed, as if listening for a hum. She walked among them and none opened their eyes, and then she sat too, and in the dream the asphalt was warm and very slightly sticky, and there was a sound like an enormous refrigerator far away, a white noise that held everything and made it harmless. She woke with tears on her face, and no reason for them. She sat at her laptop in the morning and typed an email to HR. The email said that she needed time off, that she would be available via email, that she appreciated their understanding. She deleted the email. She typed a message to Laura that said, "I think something is wrong." She deleted that too. She closed the laptop and pushed it to the side. The trackpad almost fell off the table before the friction of wood stopped it. She left it there. In the street, a small girl drew a new grid with chalk. The boxes marched longer than they should, across the curve of the cul-de-sac and into the street as if she intended to guide something where it should not go. The girl didn't number them. She drew each square with care, and then, at the end, she lifted her chalk almost reverently and dropped it into the last square. So it clacked. She didn't play. She stood, hands messy, and looked at what she'd done. She looked up at the houses. She looked directly at the window where the watching happened. She lifted her hand very slightly, not a wave, exactly, a test of a muscle. That night the swing sound came back. Creak, pause, creak. She went outside with her house shoes, even though she knew it was easier to breathe in the night air. The street was not empty. There was a figure at the stop sign, a small one. He stood with his foot on the curb, exactly as memory had told her, his head turned toward the cul-de-sac. Her ribs squeezed. "Hello," she said, the word both a question and a leaf blown past. The figure did not move. She walked closer, and the figure resolved into the sign itself, and the bush behind it, a trick of depth, a trick of wanting. She stood under the sign and felt stupid and relieved and a little sick. The stop sign's red looked matte and very dark. She touched the pole, and it was cold enough to shock her. On the way back, she almost stepped on something. She looked down. It was a set of plastic vampire teeth, the kind that come in Halloween bags by the handful, pale white and cheap, sitting on the asphalt like they'd been dropped from a height hand level to a child. One tooth had snapped and was missing, leaving a blunt gap. There was a little smear of pink on the plastic, marker or candy or something else. She bent and picked them up, and then, after holding them suspended in the air while her brain spun, she opened her hand and let them fall back to the asphalt. They made a soft sound that was not a sound at all. She went inside. She washed her hands, which felt symbolic, which felt insufficient. She stood with her fingers under the water too long, the dull warmth turning to cool. She turned it off and stood listening to the pipes equalize. The camera blinked in the other room. She unplugged it. The absence of its tiny hum relieved her more than she wanted to admit. The morning brought the same. It always did. The spreadsheet on her laptop waited with its quiet columns. The street held the same curve. A dog barked 2 houses down. The chalk lines on the pavement faded slightly, where you could see if you had looked at them too much. She went to the window and pressed her forehead to the glass, and left a print that would linger and make her feel, later, that someone else had been there. She closed her eyes. She opened them. The children were there again, as they would be, going about the business of staying in motion. She looked for patterns in where they put their feet. She told herself that underwear tags had to be cut out, that a seam could ruin a day. She told herself that it was all sensory and noise, bright popsicles and hot grass and bad smoothies, and fathers yelling too loud from doorways and mothers with brittle hair and teen boys throwing their heads back when they laughed so you saw their throats open. She told herself that none of this meant anything except that it had always meant this. At noon, a delivery truck came and blocked half the circle. The driver left the boxes on porches, running in little staccato bursts. A girl at the hedge trailed her hand along the leaves as she walked. There were tiny white blooms hidden under the hedge's green, the kind you have to know to notice. The girl plucked one and hid it in her pocket. The hedge moved in a wind that hadn't yet begun. The hedge moved because the girl had touched it and made it move, and then because it remembered how to. She wrote in her spreadsheet, 12:14. 2 girls touching the hedge. Silence. 0. She closed the spreadsheet again almost immediately and felt ridiculous. She minimized the window. She opened something else. She thought of an email she could send. She did not send it. The cursor waited. The neighborhood breathed. The afternoon steeped slowly in heat, as though someone had dropped a tea bag into the day. Shadows went long. A bike chain squeaked, and then corrected itself. She forgot to stand up from her chair. For so long her legs tingled when she finally did. The house had a familiar smell she couldn't place, something that might have been her own skin, the way a house takes on its inhabitants' air when too few windows open for too long. She went outside at dusk and stood at the edge of her lawn with no pretense. No mail. And a watering can. She watched the children the way she had watched for weeks. But this close the watching felt different. A little girl with pigtails and trailing laces ran past, and her shoelace smacked her ankle with every step. "Your shoe," she called. The girl didn't stop. She didn't even turn her head. Maybe she hadn't heard. The sound of the lace hitting skin faded into the general noise. A boy rolled slowly on a scooter, kicking the asphalt with a bare foot. He looked at her the way kids do when they look up from a game and see something peripheral. His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Hi," she said, the word a pebble in her mouth. He nodded once and rolled on, his foot making a soft flapping sound. She had the sense of a temperature drop, a kind of shifting even though the air still held the day's warmth. The children's voices thinned for a moment, not to silence exactly, but to an interiorness, as if the sound went into them instead of out. They paused, almost in unison, eyes angled toward that familiar point in space longer than a joke requires. The hair on her arms lifted, and then, just as quickly, whatever it was past. The noise filled back in, someone shouted a name. Someone else pretended not to hear. The unison dissolved. A mother called a child in. The child pretended not to hear. A little pantomime everyone knows. The mother stepped out onto her porch and repeated the child's name exactly the same way, and then, under her breath, added a third syllable that wasn't part of the name at all, a sound like a smoothing of something rough. The child turned immediately and went toward her without making a face or dragging his feet. It was nothing. It was nothing. She stood there until it was darker than it should have been, then went back inside. She dreamed that night not about chalk or asphalt, but about a spreadsheet. She scrolled down, and the rows never ended, and in each cell there was a tiny single letter. And when she zoomed in, the letters spelled almost words that evaporated when she tried to read them. She woke with the urge to cry, and didn't. When she walked into the dining room, the camera was plugged back in. She didn't remember plugging it in. She put her hand on the cord and felt the slightest warmth, as if it had been on for hours. She opened the app out of a reflex she told herself she had abandoned. The night's footage was blankly ordinary. A moth, the curve of light, a shadow that resolved into a neighbor's late return, the brief, bright triangle of someone's phone screen when they checked messages walking home. She scrubbed through .at303, the feed warped and corrected. She thought of the face she had seen once and didn't see it now. She turned the camera so its eye faced the wall. Later, a knock on the door, not the quick rap of a delivery. A hesitant, human knock. She went and looked through the peephole. A child's face up close, magnified and fishbowled by the glass, pushed into the circle until it became mostly eye. She didn't breathe. She thought of not breathing, and then did it anyway. A small, deliberate inhale. The child stepped back, and she saw it was the gap-toothed boy who had asked for water. She opened the door enough to make a shape. "Can I have water?" he asked, as if she had been waiting there for him. The script familiar. "Yes," she said. She went to get it and came back, and when she opened the door again, the boy's head was turned toward the hedge line, not so much looking as a lining. "Thank you," he said when he took the cup. He did not drink it immediately, but held it like a prop. He looked at her ankle. "Your lace is untied." She had no laces. She looked down at her house shoes and laughed before she could edit herself. The laugh made the boy smile, and then not. He drank in one long pull, then handed her the cup. "You should come outside more," he said again, the phrase worn smooth. "I am," she said, even though she wasn't, even though standing in the doorway at night did not count. He nodded and turned and went toward the hedge. He did not touch it. He walked parallel to it, and she watched until he was at the house two down and then out of sight. She closed the door and held the cup until the condensation slipped and a drop fell onto her bare foot. The drop was cold enough to feel like an answer to a question she didn't know how to ask. She went to her window and did not look. She stood with her back to the glass and counted to 12, her old talisman. She turned only after she reached it, and when she did, everything outside was as it had been, as it would be, children in the soft light of evening, running not because they were chased, but because they were accustomed to motion, laughter caught and released and caught again, their eyes sliding across the edges of the neighborhood, not because a thing was there, but because they had taught themselves to expect the edges to hold more than the center. She put her palm to the glass, and for a moment it felt like a second hand met it on the other side. Then it was only cool and smooth, and the print she left was the exact shape of her own. That night, when the swing creak began, she did not get up. She counted it. She let each creak slide past her, like a wave that never reached where it wanted to go. She imagined the empty playground that was nowhere near here, and everywhere, at once, steel chain humming, black rubber seat twisting slowly. She imagined it because imagination was the thing that moved, not anything else. She lay with her hands on her stomach and stared at the dark and cataloged where everything was. Camera, unplugged, glass clear, hedge, a line, chalk fading, children, asleep or not. Her own breath, regular, the house around her, quiet as if in a held breath that it would eventually let out. She closed her eyes. She opened them. The night passed cleanly through,